All right, so I'd like to talk to you about a statistical anomaly detection technique. There are many, this is just one, but I found this one to be particularly useful. First, a little background about me. My name is David Auclair. I am part of the CanSSOC project, and I've been with CanSSOC since the very start. I'm responsible for building the large-scale event processing and analysis infrastructure. I've got more of an engineering and analysis background. I'm not a statistician, but I found this to be particularly useful. So why a statistical approach? There's a huge and growing amount of log data, and extracting meaningful insights into this massive data set can be challenging. So there are several approaches, such as machine learning and others. But the statistical approach I'm going to show you today is a good way to get started. So why statistical analysis? So this method can be useful to quickly highlight behavioral outliers. It could be described as like a weighted multivariate z-score method, which is an actual statistical method. Although I have tweaked it here and there in order to make it more aligned to my particular usage. So the first step is to identify and extract measurable indicators. Now, the wider variety of indicators, the better. So for instance, geographical outliers, like via GeoIP, is generally useful, but it can be easily misled by VPN or proxy users. It's much better to also include behavioral indicators, which might indicate account abuse, such as unusually high number of emails sent or journal articles accessed. So similarly for systems, the wider variety of indicators, the better. These indicators combine to form a behavioral snapshot, which form the basis of comparison. So there's two main ways to determine the baseline behavior. The first is against peers. So for the same sample period, which could be a specific day or even several days combined, we'll determine the average and the standard deviation for each indicator across all users of systems. And the second approach is against historical behavior. So for the same user or system, we'll determine their indicator scores across several sample periods. So each sample period could be 1 day. You would want to have many days represented as kind of the behavioral baseline. And the more of a statistical base you can get for this, the better. And then with this data set in hand, we will determine their individual average and standard deviations for each indicator. So now that we've got a behavioral baseline, we can determine scoring for each user or system. So we'll need to calculate how many standard deviations above the baseline they're scoring for each indicator. We're only considering scores above the baseline, so we're clamping the lower bound at 0. Any scores below 0 will be automatically bumped up to 0. And the score for each indicator is so it's the value of the indicator for that user minus the average for that indicator divided by the standard deviation for that indicator. That's about as fancy as we're going to get math-wise. And we're going to calculate the weighted sum of each indicator. So once you've determined the weighted score for each user or system, you would want to select the highest scores for further investigation. And so to determine the weights, you would start with a weight of 1.0, say, and then as you're investigating the top scores, you may find that certain indicators are either overrepresented or underrepresented. You can feel free to adjust the weights as needed to obtain a reasonable balance. You may also need to exclude certain events based on a filter. So for example, if you're scoring based on geographic outliers, you would want to include VPN login data, but you might want to exclude logins from the VPN subnet because the geographic outlier would show that it's occurring in 2 places. places, but really it's occurring where the VPN login happened. But similarly, if you're scoring on behavioral indicators such as journal access, you would want to be sure to include the behavior from the VPN subnet. So be careful how you're filtering events. You don't want to filter to tune one indicator, but negatively affect another indicator. So this actual statistical analysis algorithm isn't all that difficult. The real challenge is the tuning. But if you continually improve over time and take the time to identify why false positives or negatives are occurring, you can work towards a pretty well-tuned system that delivers pretty decent results overall. So I think we can move on to questions.
Yes, we can move on to questions. So we've got a couple over there. Really great topic. I kind of have a stats background, so I'm in the background sort of geeking out at this. So wonderful. First question we have is from Mark, Waterloo. How do you account for different department and user group differences? For example, finance sampling versus data center sampling to avoid overgeneralization?
So that's a great question. And depending on how different the behavior is between these different groups, you might actually want to separate that group into its own pool, right? And then consider it as its own pure baseline, which might give you more representative data. But that might be for the more extreme cases. If you tune it appropriately, I mean, you could probably work with it all together.
Wonderful. Next question we have is from Wade, and he's asking, have you seen or read Understanding Variation, the Key to Managing Chaos by Donald Wheeler? In it, you're smirking, he discusses statistical process control with a method of separating assignable causes and unassignable for help identifying causes that warrant deeper investigation and correction. In any case, besides good content, it's actually a pretty fun, entertaining stats related book, which I think is saying something. So really more of a commentary, and I actually have picked up that book, Wade, so thank you. I guess the question is, do you have a method for splitting false positives from negative positives?
I'm smirking because I know you had to read that whole thing. I actually haven't read that book, but I'll add that one to my reading list. It sounds like a good one. Thank you.
We do have a question in the panelists. Do you have a methodology for automating the evolution of baselines over time as conditions change? An ability to account for real-world events that drive unusual patterns, soccer World Cup, or that's something I was actually just thinking about, or the Olympics.
So for the pure baseline approach, you're actually looking at it kind of in a time slice, right? So you are looking at it as events change. So the baseline is kind of adaptable, right? So for instance, I mean, I was doing this same approach at University of Toronto before CanSSOC, but I know every Christmas break we would see a huge spike in travel, right? And but the method actually does kind of account for that, because on average people are traveling more, and so that kind of pure baseline, it kind of does adapt to reflect that a little bit. So it's not perfect, no, but I mean it does actually somewhat account for that.
Thank you. From Peter. Thoughts about using anomaly detection with deep learning?
Yeah, so absolutely. That's something we're working towards. I think machine learning is a very deep topic. I think that it's going to take a little bit of time to get some deep expertise, and I think the tuning on that's going to be particularly interesting. I think we're going to need a really great data set in order to build that. I'm hoping actually some of these techniques can help to, with the analyst feedback that we get, I'm hoping that can actually build like a training data set that we could maybe use for machine learning for the next generation of this.
From Mark again, what would you consider a reasonable cycle to re-baseline and retune?
So for the pure baseline, it's kind of continually rebaselining, right? But for kind of the historical behavior, if you're tracking a pretty long period, and behavior shifts in intentional, but nevertheless very significant ways. Like maybe a box that was previously not really used for much is all of a sudden a mail server, and all of a sudden it's sending lots of mail. Is it going to be lighting up the detection because of that? It might, and you might have to re-baseline when that use case of that system changes significantly.
From Simon Reed, can you comment on what tool you're using? Commercial, app tool, homegrown?
So at CanSSOC, we're actually processing somewhere on the order of a couple billion events a day, which is just scratching the surface, which is maybe a little bit hard to believe, but there's lots more data there. But we're doing Spark compute jobs for this particular analysis. So that's very scalable, sky's the limit. As much horsepower as we can throw at it, it can handle it.
Are you currently applying this to data sets, and what data sets, i.e. Zeek or Surrey?
So we do have some analysis running against Zeek for some of the system type stuff, but mostly it's been used against login data, against journal access like Easy Proxy, VPN logins, things like that. So we've had more user-centric data than system-centric data so far, but we're hoping to expand.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Zdenek. Thank you, Brian, so much. And thank you to all of our wonderful participants that asked wonderful questions and participating in our first ever lightning talk at CANHEIT. So